Good evening. Tonight we begin with a hand. My hand, actually, though I barely recognized it as mine anymore. Spring of 1973, and I was sitting in what used to be somebody's apartment on Simpson Street in the South Bronx, fourth floor of a building that had been condemned 6 months earlier, but still housed more people than it ever did when it was legal to live there. The window behind me had no glass, just a sheet of cardboard, duct-taped across the frame, that did nothing to keep out the March cold. My hand was shaking, not trembling, shaking like something inside me was trying to get out through my skin. I was waiting for Danny, and Danny was late, and when your dealer is late in 1973 in the South Bronx, you start doing mathematics in your head that have nothing to do with numbers. You calculate time in terms of sickness. How long before the sweating starts? How long before your bones begin to ache like they're dissolving? How long before you can't think about anything except the absence of the thing you need? I want you to take a second, if you're enjoying this kind of content, to like and subscribe. And in the comments, share your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far and wide our community reaches. Silence your notifications now, take a deeper breath, and let's begin. I didn't know it then, sitting in that frozen apartment with my shaking hands and my hollow chest and my track marks still fresh from that morning's shot. But I had 6 more years of this ahead of me. 6 years before I'd understand what I'd really lost. 6 years before I'd be able to look back and see the path that led me to that condemned building, to that moment, to that person I'd become, who wasn't really a person anymore, but just a need with a body attached to it. But I'm getting ahead of myself, or behind myself. Time gets confused when you're remembering through the fog of what heroin does to memory. Let me start where it actually started, which is to say, let me start before the needle, before the sickness, before the shaking hands, and the abandoned buildings, and the mathematics of desperation. I grew up on these same streets. That's the thing nobody tells you about addiction in places like the South Bronx. It's not something that comes from outside. It grows from the same concrete you played stickball on as a kid. My building, the one my family lived in, was 6 blocks from where I ended up that day, waiting for Danny. 6 blocks might as well have been 6,000 miles for all the distance I'd traveled, but geographically, I never left. The South Bronx holds on to its children, sometimes in ways that look like love, sometimes in ways that look like drowning. This was 1968 when my story really begins, though I didn't know it was beginning. I was 17. The building where we lived was on Westchester Avenue, a brick walk-up that had seen better days, but was still respectable, still maintained, still a place where people lives with actual futures. My father worked at a manufacturing plant in Hunts Point. He'd worked there since before I was born, coming home every evening with grease under his fingernails and stories about the guys on the line. My mother cleaned houses in the better neighborhoods, the ones where white families still lived before they started their exodus to the suburbs. We weren't rich. Nobody in our building was rich. But we had enough food, enough heat in winter, enough to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. I remember the exact texture of those days, the way the neighborhood felt before it started to hollow out. There was a corner store on 149th where Mr. Ramirez sold cigarettes individually if you couldn't afford a whole pack, and he'd let the kids hang around outside as long as they weren't causing trouble. There was a lot where we played stickball in the summer, arguing about whether somebody's hit counted as a home run or if it went foul off the side of the building. There were people on stoops in the evening, talking, watching the street, knowing everybody's business and everybody's kids. It felt in the way that home feels when you're young and don't know yet that home is a thing that can be taken from you, safe. I loved to read. That's a detail that matters, though I didn't know it would matter then. I'd spend hours in the public library on 152nd Street, going through everything they had. I wanted to be a teacher. I'd tell my mother this, and she'd smile and say I'd be good at it, and I believed her, because why wouldn't I? The future seemed like something that would arrive on schedule, like a bus you knew the route of. I'd graduate high school, maybe go to community college, get my degree, teach kids in neighborhoods like mine. I had it all mapped out in my head, this life I was going to have. I can still see it sometimes. That ghost life, the one I could have lived. It lives parallel to the one I ended up living, close enough to touch but separated by a wall I can never quite break through. But things were changing even then. Slowly at first, then faster than anyone could have anticipated. My father's plant started cutting shifts in '67, not laying people off completely, just reducing hours, which somehow felt worse because it meant they still needed you, but not enough to let you survive. Men who'd worked there for 20 years suddenly had 3 days a week instead of 5. They'd gather on corners in the afternoon, these men who should have been at work, trying to figure out what to do with time they never asked for. My father was one of them. I'd see him sitting at our kitchen table in the middle of the day, staring at nothing, his hands spread flat on the formica, like he was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. The white families started leaving around the same time. It happened building by building, like a slow-motion evacuation. One month, the Kowalskis were upstairs arguing about their television being too loud. The next month, their apartment was empty, and the landlord was showing it to Puerto Rican families who were moving in from even worse neighborhoods. The Jewish families on the next block packed up and headed to Co-op City, to Queens, to anywhere that wasn't here. It wasn't dramatic. There were no announcements. People just disappeared, and the buildings they left behind started to look different almost immediately. Paint peeling a little faster, trash in the halls appearing more regularly, light bulbs in the stairwells burning out and not getting replaced. I had a crew. That's what we called ourselves. Though we weren't gang members, weren't criminals, were just kids from the neighborhood who grew up together. There was Marcus, who lived 2 buildings down and wanted to be a mechanic. There was Jorge, who was funny in a way that made you forget how poor we all were. There was Carmen, who I was half in love with, though I never had the courage to tell her. We'd hang out on the corner of 149th and 3rd, not doing much, just being 17 and alive, and certain that we understood how the world worked, even though we understood nothing. That's where I first saw them. The users, the junkies. Though we didn't call them that yet, didn't have a name for what they were beyond those guys who nod off. They'd be in doorways, or slumped on stoops, or leaning against walls in that particular way, where you could tell they weren't quite present, weren't quite in their bodies. Their eyes would be half closed, their mouths slack, and they'd sway slightly like trees in a wind only they could feel. They scared me. But they also fascinated me in a way I didn't understand then, and wish I didn't understand now. Marcus said his older brother told him what they were on. Heroin. The word sounded exotic, dangerous, like something from movies about jazz musicians and underground clubs. It didn't sound like something from our neighborhood, from our ordinary streets. where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. But there they were, these nodding figures, proof that the exotic and dangerous had found us, whether we were ready for it or not. I remember asking Jorge what it felt like, and he said his cousin tried it once and said it was like being wrapped in warm water, like every problem you ever had just dissolved and floated away. I remember thinking that sounded nice, not in a way that made me want to try it, but in a way that made me understand why somebody might. Because even at 17, even with my whole future supposedly ahead of me, I had problems. The kind that seemed enormous at the time, though I'd learn later what enormous really meant. My father's depression settling over our apartment like fog. My mother's exhaustion coming through in the way she'd sit at the end of the day and just stare at her hands. The sense that something was ending and none of us knew what to do about it. The neighborhood kept changing, faster now. By 1969, there were buildings on our block, sitting empty, windows broken, doors hanging off hinges. Some landlords torched their own properties for insurance money. We'd hear the sirens at night, see the orange glow against the sky, know that another building was gone. The fire department would show up, but they were overwhelmed, fighting 6 fires a night, 8 fires, 10 fires. The South Bronx was burning, literally burning, and we all just lived around it like it was weather. I dropped out of community college after 1 semester. Couldn't afford it, couldn't focus, couldn't see the point when the future I'd imagined was dissolving like sugar in rain. I got a job at a warehouse, moving boxes, the kind of work that destroyed your back, but paid enough to help my parents with rent. I was 19. I felt ancient. I felt like my life was already over, and I was just going through the motions of a story that had already been written for me. That's when I met Danny. Not the Danny who would be my dealer later. Different Danny, though they start to blur together in my memory. Because there were so many Dannys, so many Joses, so many Mikes and Tommys and Rays, who all sold the same product and operated on the same corners and disappeared into the same void when they got arrested or died or just moved on. This Danny was a guy from the warehouse, couple years older than me, seemed to have his shit together in a way that none of us did. He had money in his pocket. He had decent clothes. He didn't have that look we all had, that look of people who were drowning slowly and knew it. One day after work, must have been summer of '69, Danny asked if I wanted to make some extra cash. Easy work, he said, just holding on to something for a few hours, passing it along when somebody came by. I knew what something meant. I wasn't stupid. But I was broke and tired and starting to understand that the rules I'd been taught about right and wrong were rules for a world that didn't exist anymore, or maybe had never existed for people like us. I said no. I remember that clearly. I said no and Danny shrugged, said no problem, said if I changed my mind, I knew where to find him. I felt good about saying no. Felt like I'd passed some kind of test, maintained some kind of integrity. I told myself I was better than that, better than the people nodding off in doorways, better than the people who'd given up. But I wasn't better. I was just luckier, and luck runs out eventually. It was Marcus who first offered me heroin, not to sell it, to use it. This was early 1970 winter, and we were in his apartment because his mother was working nights, and we had nowhere else to be. He pulled out this glassine bag, smaller than my thumbnail, with a little stamp on it that I don't remember now, though I'd memorize 1,000 stamps over the years to come. He said his cousin gave it to him, said we should try it, said it wasn't a big deal. Everybody was doing it. I remember looking at that tiny bag and thinking about all the promises I'd made to myself, about the person I wanted to be, about my mother who cleaned other people's houses so I could have better, about the teacher I'd planned to become, standing in front of a classroom, making a difference. Then I thought about my father sitting at the kitchen table with nowhere to go and nothing to do. I thought about the building next door that had burned the week before. I thought about the future I'd imagined that was never going to arrive. And I thought about what Jorge said his cousin said, like being wrapped in warm water, like every problem just dissolving away. Marcus had already tried it, he said. Sniffing, not shooting, because shooting was for junkies, and we weren't junkies. We were just kids trying something once, just seeing what it felt like. He showed me how. Put some powder on a piece of foil, heated it from underneath with a lighter, inhaled the smoke through a straw. Simple, easy. Nothing scary about it when you broke it down into steps. The rush didn't hit me right away. For a few seconds, I thought maybe nothing would happen. Maybe I was immune. Maybe I'd be one of those people who tried it and felt nothing and never understood what the big deal was. Then it arrived. Not like a wave, like a warm blanket being pulled over everything sharp and cold and painful, like somebody had reached inside my chest and untied a knot I didn't know was there. Like every muscle in my body had been clenched for years, and suddenly, finally, they could relax. I didn't think anything. That was the revelation. For the first time in months, maybe years, my head was quiet. No anxiety about money, no worry about my father, no guilt about dropping out of school, no fear about what was happening to our neighborhood, to our lives, to us. Just quiet, just peace, just this warm, soft, perfect feeling that everything was okay, had always been okay, would always be okay. I remember leaning back against Marcus's couch, closing my eyes and thinking, this is what home is supposed to feel like. This is what it feels like to be safe. I was so stupid. God, I was so incredibly stupid. But I didn't know that then. Then, I just felt good. Better than good. I felt like I discovered something precious. Something secret. Something that explained why those people nodded off in doorways. Because if you felt like this, why would you want to feel any other way? Why would you choose to go back to the cold and the sharp edges and the constant low-level panic that was just part of being alive? Marcus and I finished the bag, sat there for hours, not talking much, just existing in that warm water Jorge's cousin had described. When it started to wear off, when the world started coming back into focus with all its problems and sharp edges, I felt the absence of it. Not like being sick, not yet. Just like missing something I'd only just discovered, but somehow felt I'd been missing my whole life. I went home that night, walked the 6 blocks through streets that were getting more dangerous every week, past buildings that were burning or already burned, past people who were nodding off or coughing or dying, and I didn't feel scared. I felt like I'd found an answer to a question I didn't know I was asking. My mother was still awake when I got in. She looked at me, and I thought for a second she knew. That somehow mothers always know, that she could see what I'd done written across my face. But she just asked if I'd eaten dinner, said there was rice and beans in the fridge if I was hungry, went back to a magazine. I said I wasn't hungry, went to my room, lay on my bed, closed my eyes, tried to find that feeling again just by remembering it. I couldn't. The memory was already fading, already becoming something I'd experienced rather than something I was experiencing. And that gap between the memory and the reality, that's where it started. That's where it always starts. In the space between how good you remember feeling and how bad you feel now. In the distance between warmth and cold, safety and fear, peace and panic. I told myself I wouldn't do it again. It was a one-time thing, a curiosity satisfied, an experience to file away and maybe mention someday when I was older, when I was safe, when I could talk about the time I tried heroin when I was young and stupid and came out the other side unscathed. But I thought about it the next day, and the day after that. And by the end of the week, I was asking Marcus if he could get more. He could. His cousin knew a guy. Everybody knew a guy. That was the thing about heroin in the South Bronx in 1970. You didn't have to go looking for it. It was already there, waiting for you, patient as death. We started using once a week, then twice a week, then whenever we could afford it, which became more often as I started finding ways to afford it. Nothing dramatic at first, just skipping lunch and using that money. Just not buying the things I needed and buying what I wanted instead. Just small adjustments to my budget, my life, my priorities. I still thought I was in control, still thought this was something I was choosing to do, not something that was choosing me. I'd see the real junkies, the people who'd been using for years and think, I'll never be like that. I'm different, I'm smarter. I know when to stop. The summer of 1970 was when it started to change, when using stopped being something fun and started being something necessary. I don't know exactly when it happened. There was no moment I can point to and say, there, that's where I crossed the line. It was more like waking up one day and realizing you'd been walking in the wrong direction for so long that you couldn't see where you started anymore. I'd wake up feeling wrong. Not sick, not yet, but off. Like my body was missing something it needed. Like there was a low-level static running through my nervous system that wouldn't shut off. And I knew, not consciously, not in words, but in some deeper, more fundamental way, that using would make it stop. That if I could just get well, everything would be okay again. So I did. I got well, and I was okay again. Until I wasn't. Until the okay wore off, and I needed to get well again. Until my days started organizing themselves around this rhythm. Sick, well, sick, well, sick, well. Like breathing, except you could die if you stopped. I lost my job at the warehouse in the fall, stopped showing up on time, then stopped showing up at all, then stopped caring that I'd lost it. My mother cried. My father didn't say anything, just looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. Disappointment, maybe? Or recognition? Maybe he saw in me what he'd been fighting in himself. The understanding that we were all drowning and there were no lifeguards coming. Carmen stopped talking to me around the same time. I don't remember why exactly. I remember her saying something about me being different, about me scaring her, about not knowing who I was anymore. I wanted to tell her I was the same person I'd always been, but I couldn't because it wasn't true. I wasn't the same person. I was becoming someone else. Or maybe I was becoming nothing, just a space where a person used to be. By winter, I was using every day. By spring of 1971, I tried shooting up for the first time. By summer, I couldn't remember what I'd wanted to be before I wanted to be high. Teacher. That seemed like something from another life, something that had happened to somebody else. The South Bronx kept burning, buildings kept emptying, people kept leaving or dying or giving up. And somewhere, in all of that destruction and abandonment, I realized I fit in now. I belonged to this place in a way I never had when I was trying to be better than it. I was part of the landscape now, part of the ruins. I remember thinking, maybe in late 1971, maybe early 1972, at least I'm not alone in this. At least there are others. At least we have each other. All of us who'd chosen the needle over the future, who'd traded tomorrow for today, who'd found that warm water and decided to stop swimming and just let ourselves sink. But we didn't have each other. Not really. We were just drowning in proximity, mistaking our shared destruction for community. And I still had years to go before I'd hit bottom. Years to go before I'd understand what I'd given up for that first perfect moment of warmth and peace and home. Years to go before I'd be sitting in that abandoned apartment on Simpson Street, hands shaking, waiting for a dealer who was late, doing mathematics in my head that had nothing to do with numbers. The person I used to be, the one who wanted to be a teacher, who loved to read, who had plans and dreams and a future. He was still in there somewhere, getting smaller every day, getting quieter, getting harder to remember, but not quite gone yet. That would come later. The complete erasure, the total surrender. For now, I was still in what you might call the beginning, though I didn't know it was a beginning because I didn't know yet what middle looked like, what bottom looked like, what 6 years in hell looked like. I just knew I'd found something that made me feel okay, and I'd do anything to keep feeling that way. Anything at all. Thank you for the correction. You're absolutely right. I need to adjust my word count tracking. If section 1 was actually 3,871 words, instead of my estimated 2,512, then I need to recalibrate for the remaining sections. The needle changed everything. That's what they don't tell you when you start sniffing, when you're convincing yourself that you're not really a junkie, because real junkies shoot up, and you're just sniffing, just chasing the dragon, just keeping it casual. They don't tell you that the needle is waiting for you, patient, inevitable. Like a door, you swear you'll never walk through until one day you're standing on the other side, wondering when you crossed the threshold. It was Jorge who showed me how. Summer of 1971, in the bathroom of an apartment that belonged to somebody neither of us knew, at a party that wasn't really a party but just a bunch of people getting high in various corners of various rooms. Jorge had been shooting for a few months by then. He'd lost weight. His eyes had that hollow look I'd seen in the older users, the ones who'd been at it for years. But he seemed happy to see me, seemed eager to share what he'd learned, like it was a skill he was proud of mastering. Sniffing is wasteful, he said, pulling out his works from a cigarette pack. A syringe, a bent spoon, a lighter, a piece of cotton. The sacraments of a religion I didn't know I'd already converted to. You're losing half of it. Shooting, you get everything. You feel everything. I'd sworn I'd never do it. Had drawn that line very clearly in my head. Sniffing was one thing. Shooting was something else entirely. Shooting was crossing over into territory where you couldn't pretend anymore that you had it under control, that you were just experimenting, that you could stop whenever you wanted. But I was there in that bathroom, and I'd already started feeling sick when I went too long without using. And Jorge was my friend, or had been my friend, or was whatever passes for friendship when you're both drowning, and occasionally you grab onto each other to stay afloat for a few more minutes. and the heroin I'd been sniffing wasn't working as well as it used to. I needed more of it to feel the same. My tolerance was building, my body was adapting, and the mathematics of my addiction were starting to require solutions I didn't want to calculate. "Just once," I said. "Just to try it." Jorge smiled. Not a happy smile, a knowing smile. The smile of someone who'd said the same thing and knew how that story ended. He cooked the dope in the spoon, drew it up through the cotton to filter out the cut, tapped the syringe to get the air bubbles out. His hands were steady. He'd done this 1,000 times. He tied off my arm with his belt, had me make a fist, slapped my inner elbow until a vein rose up like it was eager to meet the needle. I watched all of this happening to my arm, like it was happening to someone else's arm, like I was outside my body, observing a scene I had no control over. "You're gonna feel it right away," Jorge said. "It's not like sniffing. It hits you all at once. Don't be scared." The needle went in. I felt the pinch, the slight burn. Jorge pulled back on the plunger, and blood flowered into the chamber, dark red mixing with the brown solution. "That's how you know you're in," he said. Then he pushed the plunger down. For maybe 3 seconds, nothing happened. I thought maybe it wouldn't work, maybe I was different, maybe my body would reject it, and I'd be spared from whatever came next. Then it hit. Not like sniffing, not like the slow warmth spreading through your chest and limbs. This was instantaneous. This was total. This was every cell in my body simultaneously sighing in relief, like they'd been waiting their entire existence for this exact chemical intervention. My knees went weak. My vision tunneled. I felt my head drop back against the tile wall, and I heard myself make a sound I'd never made before, something between a gasp and a moan, something involuntary and animal. "Yeah," Jorge said quietly. "Yeah, that's it." The rush lasted maybe 30 seconds, the most intense feeling I'd ever experienced, would ever experience, like every good thing that had ever happened to me condensed into half a minute of pure transcendence. Then it settled into that familiar warmth, that sense of everything being okay, but deeper now, more complete, more total than it had ever been from sniffing. I understood immediately why people threw their lives away for this. Because this wasn't just feeling good. This was feeling like you'd found the thing you'd been missing your entire life. The piece that made you whole. The answer to every question you'd ever asked. This was religious. This was salvation. This was coming home to a home that was more home than any physical place could ever be. "Better than sniffing, right?" Jorge asked. I couldn't speak, could only nod, could only sit there against that bathroom wall, feeling my body relax into itself in ways I hadn't known were possible, feeling my mind quiet in ways that seemed almost holy. The high lasted for hours, but the high wasn't the problem. The high was never the problem. The problem was what came after. I woke up the next morning in my own bed with no memory of how I got there. My arm hurt where the needle had gone in. There was a small bruise forming, purple and tender. I lay there, looking at it, this mark on my body that proved last night had been real, that I'd actually done it, that I'd crossed the line I swore I'd never cross. And I felt wrong. Not sick exactly, not yet, but wrong. Like my body knew something my mind didn't, like my cells had already started reorganizing themselves around this new chemical reality. Like I'd made a deal I didn't fully understand the terms of. I told myself I wouldn't do it again. The shooting, I mean. I could go back to sniffing. I could maintain some kind of boundary, some kind of control. I wasn't like the people I'd seen, the ones with arms covered in track marks, the ones who'd wear long sleeves in summer to hide what they'd become. I was different. I was smarter. But by the end of that week, I was back in that bathroom with Jorge, and the week after that. And then I bought my own works so I wouldn't have to share, so I wouldn't have to wait for Jorge to be available, so I could do it whenever I wanted, which was, increasingly, all the time. The sickness started in earnest around October of 1971. The first time I went through real withdrawal, I thought I was dying. I'd gone about 16 hours without using, not by choice, but because I couldn't find Danny or any of the other dealers I knew, because it was Sunday and the spots were dry, because sometimes you just got unlucky. I woke up in the middle of the night with my muscles cramping, my skin crawling, sweat pouring off me despite the cold. My bones ached. Not like they hurt, like they were trying to escape my body from the inside. I couldn't lie still, couldn't get comfortable in any position. My legs kept moving on their own, this restless jerking that I couldn't control. I knew what it was. I'd seen other people go through it, but knowing didn't make it better. Knowing just made it worse, because I understood that this was my life now. This was the deal I'd made without reading the contract. Feel better than you've ever felt when you use, feel worse than you've ever felt when you don't. I got well the next morning, found a dealer, scored, shot up in an alley behind a building on 149th Street. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. The sickness just vanished, like it had never been there, like I'd imagined it. But I hadn't imagined it, and it would come back. Every time I went too long without using, it would come back, and each time it would be a little worse, a little harder to endure, a little more convincing in its argument that I needed heroin not to feel good, but just to function, just to be human, just to survive. That's when I understood the truth that every addict eventually understands. I wasn't using to feel good anymore. I was using to not feel sick. The high was just a brief window between doses of medicine I needed to take to avoid unbearable suffering. Heroin wasn't my pleasure anymore. It was my maintenance, my normal. The baseline I had to achieve just to get out of bed. My whole life reorganized itself around this new reality. Everything became secondary to the primary goal of not being sick. Getting money became my full-time job. Finding dealers became my second job. Using became my reward, my relief, my only real accomplishment in any given day. I'd wake up already calculating. How much money do I have? How much do I need? Where can I cop? How long until I start feeling bad? What can I steal or sell or beg to make the numbers work? I started stealing from my parents. Small amounts at first. $10 from my mother's purse, $20 from the jar my father kept in the closet. Telling myself I'd pay it back, knowing I wouldn't. Doing it anyway, because the alternative was being sick, and being sick was not an option I could tolerate. They knew. Of course they knew. But what could they do? Kick me out? They tried that once, in the winter of '72. Told me I couldn't live there anymore if I was going to steal from them and use drugs and bring that life into their home. I left, stayed with Jorge for a week, sleeping on his floor, using more because I didn't have to hide it anymore. Then I came back begging, promising I'd change, promising I'd stop. Promises I meant when I made them, but couldn't keep, because wanting to stop and being able to stop were two entirely different things. My mother cried a lot that year. I'd hear her at night in the bedroom she shared with my father, crying quietly so she wouldn't wake me, like I wasn't already awake, like I wasn't lying in my own bed hating myself for being the reason she was crying. My father stopped talking to me almost entirely, would look at me sometimes with this expression that I couldn't quite read, disgust maybe, or grief, or just exhaustion. The exhaustion of watching someone you love destroy themselves and not being able to stop them. Carmen saw me on the street one day in early 1972. I was walking to meet a dealer, already starting to feel sick, already doing the mathematics in my head about whether I had enough money and what I'd need to do if I didn't. She called my name and I turned around, and for a second, she didn't recognize me. I could see it in her face, the confusion, the shock at what I'd become in the year since we'd stopped talking. "Jesus," she said. "What happened to you?" I wanted to tell her. Wanted to explain that I hadn't meant for it to go this far, that I'd just been trying to feel okay for a little while, that it had all gotten away from me so fast I didn't even realize I was drowning until I was already under. But I couldn't find the words, and I was sick, and I had somewhere to be. So I just shrugged and said I was fine, and walked away, while she stood there watching me go with this look of horror and pity that I can still see if I close my eyes. The South Bronx was collapsing around us that year, buildings burning every night, entire blocks reduced to rubble. The fires were so common, we stopped paying attention to them. You'd hear sirens and smell smoke and see the orange glow against the sky and just think, another one, and go back to whatever you were doing. The city was pulling back resources. Fewer cops, fewer firefighters, fewer of everything except drugs and crime and desperation. It felt sometimes like we were living in a war zone, like the neighborhood was under siege by forces nobody could name or fight. But for me, the siege was internal. The war was in my own body, my own blood, my own cells that had learned to need something they were never supposed to need. Every day was a battle just to get well, just to feel normal, just to function enough to get through to the next day so I could fight the same battle again. I overdosed for the first time in March of 1972. Not on purpose. I'd gotten a bag that was stronger than usual, purer than the garbage we were usually getting, and I shot my normal amount without realizing it was going to hit different. I remember pushing the plunger. I remember the rush being bigger than expected, overwhelming, scary instead of pleasant. I remember thinking, this is too much. Then I remember nothing. Jorge told me later that I stopped breathing, that my lips turned blue, that he slapped me and shook me and finally threw me in a cold shower, until I started gasping and coughing and came back from wherever I'd gone. I don't remember any of it. I just remember waking up wet and freezing, my chest aching, Jorge standing over me looking terrified. "You almost died," he said. I nodded. I understood. I'd almost died. It happened. People overdosed all the time. Sometimes they came back, sometimes they didn't. I'd been lucky, and then, maybe 6 hours later, when the dope had worn off and I was starting to feel sick again, I went out and scored and shot up again. Because almost dying didn't change anything. Almost dying was just another thing that happened, another close call, another story to tell if anyone cared to listen. That was the year I stopped being a person and became an addict. The year I lost the ability to imagine a future that didn't include heroin. The year I accepted that this was my life now, that I'd made choices I couldn't unmake, that I'd crossed lines I couldn't uncross, that I'd become something I couldn't unbecome. I was 20 years old. I looked 40. I weighed maybe 130 pounds. My arms were covered in track marks that I'd tried to hide by rotating injection sites, but there were only so many veins, and eventually they all bore witness to what I was doing to myself. My teeth were starting to rot. My skin had that grayish tinge that comes from malnutrition and chronic drug use. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a real meal, the last time I'd slept through the night, the last time I'd gone a full day without using. I'd see my reflection sometimes in store windows or bathroom mirrors and have this moment of disconnect where I didn't recognize myself. Who was that person? That hollow-eyed, emaciated ghost wearing my face? That couldn't be me. I was the kid who loved to read, who wanted to be a teacher, who had plans and dreams and a future. But it was me. This was what I'd become. This was the person on the other side of that first perfect high, that first warm embrace, that first moment of peace and relief and home. And I still had 4 more years to go before I hit bottom. 4 more years of sickness and using and stealing and lying and degradation. 4 more years of watching myself disappear piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. But I didn't know that yet. I just knew I needed to get well, needed to find money, needed to find a dealer, needed to do it again and again and again, forever, until I died or something changed, and dying seemed more likely than change. The descent wasn't over. I was just learning how far down went. There's a routine to addiction that nobody talks about. People imagine chaos, and there is chaos. But mostly, there's just the same thing happening over and over again, until the repetition itself becomes a kind of prison. Wake up sick, get money, find the dealer, get well, feel okay for a few hours, start to fade, begin to panic, do it all again, every single day, the same mathematics, the same desperation, the same relief that never quite lasts long enough. By 1973, I'd perfected the routine. I could tell you exactly how many hours I had between doses before the sickness started. Exactly how much money I needed per day to stay functional. Exactly which dealers worked which corners at which times. Exactly how to make a vein rise when all the good ones had collapsed. I'd become an expert in my own destruction. I'd wake up around 6 in the morning, already feeling wrong. Not fully sick yet, but the warning signs. A slight ache in my legs, a restlessness under my skin. My brain starting to whisper that I needed to do something, get something, fix this before it got worse. I'd lie there for maybe 10 minutes doing the inventory. How much money did I have? Where did I leave my works? Did I have anything stashed for emergencies? The answer to that last one was always no. Addicts don't save for tomorrow. We can barely think past the next few hours. I'd get up, check my pockets, check the corners of the room, check anywhere I might have hidden money and forgotten about it. Sometimes I'd find a few dollars, sometimes nothing. The amount determined how desperate the day would be, how quickly I'd need to move, how far I'd need to go to make the numbers work. Simpson Street was where I spent most of my time by then. The building I mentioned before, the condemned one where I'd wait for Danny, that became my default location. 4th floor, apartment that used to belong to somebody, but now belonged to nobody and everybody. Whoever showed up could claim it for a few hours. The windows were broken. The pipes had been ripped out by scavengers looking for copper to sell. The walls were tagged with graffiti and slogans, and the names of people who'd probably OD'd or gone to prison, or just disappeared into the void that swallows addicts eventually. But it was shelter. And in the South Bronx in 1973, Shelter was a luxury, even if it came with rats and no heat, and the constant smell of human waste. The first stop was always finding money. If I had none, which was often, I'd go boosting. Shoplifting, they called it. But that sounds too clean. What I did was walk into bodegas or drugstores, or anywhere that had merchandise, stuff things into my jacket, and walk out hoping nobody noticed or cared enough to stop me. I'd gotten good at it. Quick hands, calm face. The trick was to not look nervous, to act like you belonged. There, like you were just another customer, and not a desperate junkie stealing to avoid being sick. I'd take the stolen goods to a fence, guy named Polly, who operated out of a pawn shop on 149th. He'd give you maybe a quarter of what the stuff was worth, sometimes less if he knew you were sick and couldn't wait. A radio worth $40, he'd give you 10. Cigarettes worth 20, you'd get 5. The math never worked in your favor, but you took what you could get because the alternative was being sick, and being sick was worse than any bad deal. Some days I'd work the parking meters, walk down the street with a butter knife or a piece of wire, checking meters until I found one that was full, then jimmy it open and take the change. Tedious work. Risky too, because if cops caught you, it was a guaranteed arrest. But it was money, and money meant dope, and dope meant not being sick, so you did what you had to do. The worst days were when I couldn't boost anything, couldn't find any meters worth hitting, couldn't scrape together enough for even one bag. Those days, I'd end up doing things I don't like to remember. Things that degraded what was left of my humanity. Things I told myself I'd never do, until I was doing them because the sickness doesn't care about your dignity or your principles or your sense of self-worth. The sickness just demands to be fed, and you'll feed it however you can. By mid-morning, if things went right, I'd have enough money for at least 2 bags. Maybe 3 if I'd had a good run. I'd head to the copping spot, usually the corner of Simpson and Westchester, where dealers worked in shifts like it was a legitimate business. Different people at different times, but they all sold the same product with different stamps. Murder 1, Dead on Arrival, Blue Magic. The names were meant to advertise potency, to suggest that this batch was so strong it might kill you, and somehow that was a selling point, because if it could kill you, it could definitely get you high. The dealers knew me by then, knew I'd be there every day, knew I was reliable in my desperation. Sometimes they'd front me a bag if I was short, knowing I'd be back tomorrow with their money, because addicts always come back. We're the most reliable customers in any economy. We never stop buying. We never comparison shop. We never decide we don't need the product anymore. We're every businessman's dream, except we're also everyone's nightmare. I'd cop my bags, find somewhere private, an alley, a stairwell, that apartment on Simpson Street, and get to work. The ritual was always the same. Pull out the works, the spoon, bent and blackened from repeated use, the lighter, the syringe, hopefully still sharp enough to penetrate a vein on the first try, the cotton, torn from a cigarette filter or pulled from a Q-tip. Sometimes I'd be shaking so bad I could barely cook the dope, could barely draw it up, could barely hit the vein, but desperation steadies your hand, eventually. Fear of being sick makes you capable of things you wouldn't think possible. Tie off, make a fist, find a vein. This got harder as time went on. The good veins in my arms collapsed from overuse, scarred and hardened until they were useless. I moved to my hands, then my feet, then places I don't want to describe, because thinking about it makes me feel sick in a different way, makes me remember what I was willing to do to my own body just to avoid withdrawal. The needle goes in, pull back, see the blood flow in the chamber, push the plunger, wait for it. The rush never got old. Even after hundreds of times, thousands maybe, it still hit like that first time with Jorge in the bathroom. That instant relief, that sense of everything wrong becoming right, that warmth spreading through your chest and limbs like you were being filled with liquid peace. For 30 seconds, maybe a minute, you'd feel invincible, feel whole, feel like you'd made the right choice, like everything that led you to this moment was worth it. Then the rush would fade into the high, that familiar warmth, that quiet mind, that sense of being okay, of being normal, of being able to function. I'd sit there, wherever I was, and just exist for a while. Not happy exactly, not the euphoria of the early days, just normal, just not sick, just able to breathe without panic, just human again, or what passed for human when you were this far gone. The high would last maybe 4 hours if you were lucky, 3 if the dope was weak or you'd built up too much tolerance. You'd feel it start to fade around the edges, the warmth receding, the problems creeping back in, your mind starting to get louder. And underneath it all, the quiet whisper of sickness beginning to gather at the edges of your consciousness, reminding you that the clock was ticking, that you'd need to do this again soon, that this relief was temporary and the cost was permanent. I'd try to stretch it, try to make the high last as long as possible by not moving much, not thinking much, just sitting still and hoping time would slow down. But it never did. 4 hours would become 3, would become 2. And then you'd feel the first real twinge of sickness. And you'd know your window was closing, that you needed to start the cycle again, that the routine was calling you back to its beginning. The other addicts became my only real community. Not friends exactly. We didn't trust each other. Couldn't trust each other when we were all desperate and stealing and lying and doing whatever we had to do to survive. But we understood each other in a way nobody else could. We spoke the same language. We knew the same mathematics. We recognized each other's sickness, each other's relief, each other's constant cycling between the two. There was Maria, who worked the same corners I did, who'd been using longer than me and looked like she'd aged 30 years in the last 5. There was Tommy, who'd been a Marine in Vietnam and came back with a heroin habit and no skills for civilian life. There was Angel, who was maybe 18 but looked 40, who'd nod off in doorways and wake up hours later, not knowing where he was or how he got there. We'd cross paths at copping spots, in shooting galleries, in the ER when one of us overdosed and needed Narcan to come back. We'd share cigarettes sometimes, share information about which dealers had good dope, which cops were making arrests, which buildings were safe to squat in. Small kindnesses in a world that had no room for kindness. Brief moments of human connection in an existence that was mostly about being alone with your need. People died regularly. You'd see someone one day, hear they OD'd the next. Or they'd get arrested and you'd never see them again. Or they'd just disappear and you'd never know if they'd gotten clean or moved away or died in some alley where nobody found them for weeks. Death was just part of the landscape. You'd mourn for maybe an hour, then you'd get back to the business of not dying yourself, of making it through another day, of finding another bag, of getting well again. I watched a guy die in the apartment on Simpson Street. Spring of 1973, maybe April. I didn't know his name. He was just someone who was there, who'd copped at the same time I did, who was shooting up in the corner while I was shooting up near the window. I did my shot, felt the rush, settled into the high, looked over at him after a few minutes, and realized he wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. His lips were turning blue. I should have done something, called 911, started CPR, something, but I was high and my brain was slow, and by the time I processed what was happening, he was already gone, just slumped in the corner, dead, while the rest of us went about our business like it was normal, like this was just another day, like death was just another part of the routine. Someone else eventually called it in. Cops came. We all scattered. I heard later that nobody ever identified him. John Doe. Just another junkie who died in the South Bronx in 1973. Just another statistic. Just another person who'd started out as someone with a name and dreams and a future and ended up as a body in an abandoned building. I thought about him sometimes, wondered who he'd been before, whether anyone missed him, whether his mother was somewhere wondering what happened to her son. But mostly, I didn't think about him because thinking about him meant thinking about my own mortality, about how close I was to being that body in the corner, about how easily I could be the next John Doe in an abandoned building while other addicts stepped over me to get to their own fixes. The days blurred together. Monday felt like Friday felt like Tuesday. Seasons changed, but the routine stayed the same. Wake up sick, get money, cop dope, get well, wait for it to wear off, do it again, over and over, an endless loop that felt like it would never end because I couldn't. Imagine an ending that didn't involve death. I stopped looking in mirrors, stopped trying to recognize myself. The person I saw reflected back wasn't someone I knew anymore, wasn't the kid who loved to read, wasn't the teenager who wanted to be a teacher, was just a hollow-eyed ghost wearing my face, going through motions that didn't mean anything, surviving without living, existing without being. My parents had given up by then, stopped crying, stopped asking me to change, just looked at me with this resignation, this acceptance that I was lost and they couldn't save me. I was still technically living at home, sleeping in my old room when I wasn't sleeping in shooting galleries or doorways or wherever I ended up. But I was a stranger there, a dangerous stranger they'd stopped trying to understand. The South Bronx kept burning, kept collapsing, kept dying around us, and we kept using, kept going through our routines, kept surviving in a place that was being systematically abandoned by everyone who had the means to leave. We were the ones who were left, the junkies and the dealers and the desperate and the forgotten. We were the garbage that the city swept into corners and tried to pretend didn't exist. And somewhere in all of that, in the endless repetition of sickness and relief, I forgot what I was doing this for, forgot what the point was, forgot that there had ever been a point beyond just making it through another day without dying. The routine had become everything. Wake up sick, get well, wait to get sick again. That was life. That was all life was. And it would continue like this for years more before anything changed. The first time I got arrested was August of 1974. I'd been boosting from a drugstore on 3rd Avenue, had a couple bottles of aspirin in my jacket that I was going to sell to Polly when the manager grabbed my arm and held me until the cops showed up. I wasn't even sick yet, had gotten well maybe 2 hours earlier, but I knew what was coming, knew that by the time they processed me, by the time they put me in a cell, I'd be deep into withdrawal with no way to make it stop. They cuffed me, put me in the back of a patrol car, drove me to the 41st precinct. Fort Apache, we called it, because it was like an armed outpost in hostile territory. The cops there had seen 1,000 junkies exactly like me. I wasn't special. I wasn't even interesting. Just another skeleton with track marks who'd stolen something worthless to feed a habit that was killing him slowly. The holding cell smelled like piss and sweat and fear. There were maybe a dozen of us crammed in there. A couple of drunks. A guy who'd beaten his wife. 3 other junkies who I could identify immediately by the way they moved, by the restlessness already starting to show in their legs, by the knowledge in their eyes that we were all about to go through hell together. The sickness started around hour 6, muscle aches first, that deep bone pain that feels like your skeleton is trying to crawl out through your skin. Then the sweating, even though the cell was cold. Then the nausea, the diarrhea, the complete physical collapse of every system in your body as it screamed for the chemical it had learned to need. I asked the guards for help, begged them, told them I was sick, that I needed to see a doctor, that I couldn't do this. They laughed. One of them said, "Should have thought about that before you became a junkie." Like it was that simple. Like I'd made one bad choice instead of 1,000 choices that all led inevitably to this moment, to this cell, to this suffering. You can't sleep through withdrawal. Your body won't let you. You lie there on the concrete bench, curled into a ball, shaking and sweating and aching, and time stops meaning anything. An hour feels like a week. A night feels like forever. The other junkies in the cell were going through the same thing. We didn't talk much, just suffered in proximity, occasionally making eye contact in a way that said, "I know. I see you. I'm here too." By morning, I would have confessed to anything if they'd promised me relief. Would have given them names, locations, whatever they wanted. But they didn't want anything from me. I was too small, too insignificant. Just a user, not a dealer. Just another junkie clogging up the system. They let me see a public defender for maybe 5 minutes. He was young, overworked, already exhausted, even though it was barely noon. He flipped through my file like he'd seen it 1,000 times before. Possession of stolen property. First offense, at least on paper. He said I'd probably get probation if I pleaded guilty. Said if I went to trial, I'd definitely lose and definitely do time. Said I should take the deal. I took the deal. Stood in front of a judge who looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. He gave me probation, told me to stay clean, stay out of trouble, report to a probation officer once a month. Told me if I violated probation, I'd go to Rikers. Said it like it was a warning that should mean something, like the threat of jail time was supposed to scare me straight. They released me that afternoon. 72 hours since my last shot. I was so sick I could barely walk. Made it 2 blocks from the courthouse before I found a dealer. Shot up in an alley behind a Chinese restaurant, sitting in garbage, shaking so hard I could barely cook the dope. The relief when it hit was so overwhelming I cried. Just sat there with the needle still in my arm, tears running down my face, feeling almost human again. The probation officer was a woman named Mrs. Henderson, black woman, maybe 50, who worked out of an office that smelled like burned coffee and disappointment. She'd seen hundreds of junkies cycle through her caseload, knew most of us would violate, would end up arrested again, would disappear into Rikers or the morgue. She tried anyway. I'll give her that. She tried. "You want to get clean?" she asked me at our first meeting. I said yes, because that's what you say. But we both knew I was lying. She gave me a list of treatment programs, places I could go for help, methadone clinics, detox centers, therapeutic communities. All of them had waiting lists. All of them had requirements I couldn't meet. Stable housing, ID, motivation to change. She knew it. I knew it. We went through the motions anyway, because that's what the system required. I tried once, showed up at a methadone clinic on 149th Street, stood in line for 2 hours with 50 other sick junkies, finally got to the window where a nurse looked at me with barely concealed contempt. She asked if I had ID. I didn't. Asked if I had proof of residency. I didn't. Said I couldn't get on the program without documentation. Said to come back when I had my paperwork in order. I left there and went straight to my dealer. Got high and forgot about treatment for another 6 months. The system wasn't designed to help people like me. It was designed to process us, to move us through courts and jails and probation offices in an endless cycle that accomplished nothing except keeping us busy, keeping us documented, keeping us in our place. Nobody was trying to save us. They were just trying to manage us, to contain us, to make sure we didn't spill over too much into the parts of the city that still functioned. I got arrested again in December. Same thing, shoplifting, violated my probation. This time, they sent me to Rikers. Rikers Island was hell dressed up as a correctional facility. Overcrowded, violent, run by guards who ranged from indifferent to sadistic. They put me in a cell with 3 other guys. One of them was a dealer who'd gotten caught with enough heroin to guarantee he'd be there for years. He had connections inside, could get dope smuggled in. Told me if I had money, he could get me well. I didn't have money, so I went through withdrawal again. This time it lasted a week, because I had no choice, because there was nowhere to run, because I was locked in a cage with my sickness and no escape. I thought I'd die. Genuinely thought my body would give up, that my heart would stop, that I'd just cease to exist because the pain was too much for a human being to endure. But I didn't die. I survived, and on day 8, when the physical symptoms had mostly passed, when I could stand without shaking and eat without vomiting, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. Just a glimpse of it. Just enough to remember that there was a version of me underneath the addiction, buried, but not quite dead. I told myself I'd stay clean when I got out, would use this forced detox as a jumping-off point, would go to meetings, get into a program, rebuild my life. I meant it. I really did. They released me after 30 days. I walked out of Rikers at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday in January 1975, cold enough that my breath made clouds. I stood there on the sidewalk, free, clean, ready to start over. I was using again by 6 p.m. Didn't even make it 3 hours. The pull was too strong. The emptiness was too big. The world without heroin was too sharp, too loud, too real. I needed the buffer, needed the warmth, needed to not feel what I was feeling, which was everything all at once, and none of it good. The system tried again. Mrs. Henderson got me into a program at Lincoln Hospital. The same hospital that was falling apart, that had rats in the ER and lead paint peeling off the walls, that had been condemned but was still operating because there was nowhere else for people in the South Bronx to go. They had a methadone program there, started after the Young Lords took over the hospital in 1970 and demanded addiction treatment for the community. I showed up the first day, stood in line with dozens of other addicts, all of us waiting for our dose of liquid methadone mixed with orange juice. The stuff was bitter, made your teeth feel weird, but it worked. It stopped the sickness. Didn't get you high, at least not really, but it kept you from being sick. that was supposed to be enough. The counselor I was assigned to was named Roberto. He'd been an addict himself years ago, before he got clean and decided to help others. He believed in the work, believed that people could change, could recover, could build lives worth living. I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard it all before, had heard a dozen versions of the same story. Hit bottom, get help, find hope, start over. None of it had ever applied to me. I stayed in the program for 3 weeks, showed up every morning, drank my methadone, went to groups where we sat in circles and talked about our feelings, our trauma, our reasons for using. I said what I was supposed to say, nodded in the right places, pretended I was engaged in the process of recovery, but I was still using on top of the methadone. Couldn't help it. The methadone kept me from being sick, but it didn't give me what I needed, which was that warmth, that peace, that sense of being okay that only heroin could provide. So I'd take my methadone in the morning and cop dope in the afternoon and tell myself I'd quit tomorrow, next week, eventually. Roberto knew, of course he knew. My urine tests came back dirty every time. He'd sit me down, talk about the importance of honesty, of commitment, of really wanting to change. He'd ask what was holding me back. I couldn't tell him the truth, which was that I didn't want to change, that I wanted to want to change, but wanting to want something is not the same as actually wanting it. They kicked me out of the program after a month. Roberto said I could come back when I was ready to be serious about recovery. I said, okay, left. Never went back. The system had done what it could, had offered me chances I couldn't take, help I couldn't accept, hope I couldn't hold on to. It wasn't the system's fault exactly. The programs were underfunded, overwhelmed, designed for people who wanted to get clean, and I wasn't ready yet. Wasn't ready to give up the only thing that made me feel okay. Wasn't ready to face what I'd become without the chemical buffer between me and reality. So I went back to the routine. Wake up sick, get money, cop dope, get well. The system kept processing me. Arrests, court dates, probation violations. But it couldn't save me. Nobody could save me except me, and I wasn't ready for that. Wouldn't be ready for years. The city gave up on us eventually. The South Bronx was too far gone, too broken, too expensive to fix. They pulled back resources, closed clinics, stopped pretending they cared. We were on our own in a neighborhood that was burning itself to the ground while the rest of the world watched and did nothing. And I kept using, kept surviving, kept waiting for something to change, even though I had no reason to believe that anything ever would. By 1976, I wasn't living anywhere. The term homeless suggests you once had a home and lost it. But I drifted so far from the concept of home that the word had lost all meaning. I slept wherever I ended up. Abandoned buildings, subway stations, doorways, the apartment on Simpson Street when nobody else had claimed it. My parents had locked me out for good after I stole my mother's wedding ring and pawned it for dope. I don't blame them. I'd stolen everything that wasn't nailed down. I'd brought danger and degradation into their lives for years. They'd mourned me while I was still alive, and eventually they had to let the ghost go. The South Bronx looked like a war zone by then. Whole blocks were just rubble and burned out husks of buildings. The fires happened every night, so many that the firefighters couldn't keep up. Wouldn't even respond to some neighborhoods, because what was the point? Let it burn. Let it all burn. That's what the city seemed to be saying. That's what it felt like living there. Like we were being left to burn while everyone who could leave did. President Ford came through in 1975, looked at what was happening, and basically told us to drop dead. That's how it felt anyway. The federal government wasn't going to save us. The city wasn't going to save us. We were on our own in a place that was collapsing in real time, and those of us who were too broken or too poor or too addicted to leave just stayed and burned along with the buildings. I weighed maybe 115 pounds by then. I'm 5'9". You could count my ribs. My teeth were rotting out of my head because I hadn't seen a dentist in years. And heroin suppresses your appetite, so you forget to eat. And when you do eat, it's garbage that provides calories, but no nutrition. My arms were a roadmap of collapsed veins and abscesses. I'd gotten infections that should have killed me. Sepsis that sent me to the ER, where they'd pump me full of antibiotics and send me back out to do it all again. My mind was going too. I'd have moments where I couldn't remember where I was, who I was, what year it was. The heroin was cut with so much garbage: quinine, baby laxative, rat poison, whatever the dealers could use to stretch their product. That I wasn't just destroying my body, I was destroying my brain. I'd hallucinate sometimes when I wasn't high, see things that weren't there, hear voices, lose time, come back to myself in places I didn't remember going to, doing things I didn't remember deciding to do. The people I'd known were mostly gone. Marcus had died of an overdose in 1974. Jorge had gotten arrested and sent upstate for dealing. Angel disappeared. Someone said he'd gotten clean and moved to Puerto Rico. Someone else said they'd found him dead in a burnt-out building. Carmen had married someone, moved to Queens, had a baby. I'd heard this through the grapevine of people who still had connections to the legitimate world. I was happy for her, happy that at least one of us had made it out. Tommy from the shooting galleries died in the spring of 1976. I found him. We'd been using together in the Simpson Street apartment, both of us chasing the same bags of dope that were going around, both of us too far gone to care much about quality or safety or anything except not being sick. He did his shot. I did mine. We sat there in our respective corners, nodding, existing in that warm space where nothing hurt and nothing mattered. When I came out of my nod, he wasn't breathing. I crawled over to him, actually crawled, because I was too high to walk, and I saw that his lips were blue. His eyes were open and empty. His chest wasn't moving. I knew he was dead. I'd seen enough dead people by then to recognize it immediately, but I sat there with him for a while anyway. Didn't call 911, didn't run, just sat there thinking about how he'd been a Marine, how he'd survived Vietnam, how he'd come home to a country that didn't want him and a habit he couldn't kick, and now he was dead in an abandoned building in the South Bronx with only a junkie for company. Eventually I left, walked out of that building and never went back. Someone else found him, called it in, and he became another statistic. Another veteran lost to the opioid epidemic that nobody wanted to talk about, that nobody knew how to fix, that was easier to ignore than to address. I thought about him for weeks afterward. Couldn't stop thinking about him, about how easily that could have been me, about how many times I'd come close to being the body instead of the person who found the body, about how the only difference between him and me was luck, and luck was a finite resource that eventually ran out for everyone. That's when something cracked, not broke. It wasn't dramatic enough to call it breaking, just cracked, like ice on a pond when the temperature rises just enough. I was sitting in a doorway on Westchester Avenue, sick because I hadn't been able to score that day, watching the sun come up over the ruins of my neighborhood, and I had this thought. I don't want to die like this. Not I don't want to die. Just I don't want to die like this, in a doorway, in an abandoned building, alone, forgotten, another John Doe that nobody identifies, that nobody mourns, that nobody remembers ever existed. I thought about my mother, wondered if she still thought about me, if she prayed for me, if she'd already accepted that I was going to die young and there was nothing she could do about it. I thought about the person I used to be, the kid who loved books, the teenager who wanted to teach, the young man who'd had dreams and plans and a future that looked like something other than this. And for the first time in years, maybe the first time since that bathroom with Jorge when I first shot up, I felt something other than sickness or relief. I felt shame, deep, crushing, overwhelming shame at what I'd become, at what I'd done, at what I'd thrown away for a chemical that didn't even work anymore, that barely kept me from being sick and never made me feel good. Shame meant I still had something to lose. Shame meant there was still a part of me that knew this wasn't who I was supposed to be. Shame meant I wasn't completely gone, wasn't completely dead inside, wasn't completely beyond reach. I overdosed 3 days later. Didn't mean to, never meant to. I'd copped from a new dealer because my regular guy wasn't around, and the dope was stronger than I expected, purer than the garbage I'd been getting. I shot my normal amount, felt the rush hit harder than it had in months, thought, this is good shit. Then I felt myself falling backward, felt my breathing slow, felt the world start to go dark in a way that was different from nodding, that was deeper and more final and absolutely terrifying. In the half second, I had to recognize what was happening. I woke up in Lincoln Hospital, the same hospital where I'd tried the methadone program, the same hospital that was falling apart, that barely functioned, that served a community the city had given up on. A nurse told me someone had found me in the alley, had called 911, that the EMTs had hit me with Narcan and brought me back. She said I'd stopped breathing, said I'd been dead, technically, for almost a minute. I lay there in that hospital bed, IV in my arm, oxygen tubes in my nose, and I looked down at my body, really looked at it for the first time in years. The track marks covering my arms like a constellation of shame. The abscesses, some fresh, some scarred over. The bruises, the emaciation, the physical evidence of 6 years of systematic self-destruction. I was 23 years old. I looked 50. I'd lost 6 years. The exact 6 years I'd somehow known about back in 1973 when I was sitting in that apartment waiting for Danny, when some part of me understood that I had a specific sentence to serve before anything could change. 6 years. 6 years of waking up sick and getting well and doing it again. 6 years of stealing and lying and degrading myself in ways I still can't think about without feeling sick. 6 years of watching people die, of almost dying myself, of being dead inside while my body kept moving through the motions of survival. I thought, not like this. I don't want to die like this. The nurse came back, asked how I was feeling. I said I was okay. She said I was lucky, said most people don't get second chances, don't get found in time, don't get Narcan before their brain dies from lack of oxygen. Said I should think about treatment, about getting help, about not ending up back here. I said I would, and this time I meant it, not because I'd had some dramatic revelation, not because I'd hit some mythical rock bottom that made me suddenly want to change, but because I was tired, So incredibly bone-deep tired of being sick, of being scared, of being this person I'd become. I didn't know if I could get clean, didn't know if I was capable of it, if I had anything left inside me that was strong enough to fight the addiction that had consumed my entire life for 6 years. But I knew I couldn't keep doing this. Knew that the next overdose might be the one where nobody found me, where there was no Narcan, where I actually died instead of just coming close. They discharged me the next day, gave me a list of treatment programs, same list Mrs. Henderson had given me years ago. I stood outside the hospital, holding that piece of paper, looking at the South Bronx burning around me, and I made a choice. Not a dramatic one, not a movie moment, just a quiet decision that I was going to try, really try. One more time. I didn't know if it would work, didn't know if I'd make it a day, a week, a month. Didn't know if I had it in me to be the person who survived instead of the person who became a statistic. But I knew I had to try, because the alternative was Tommy in that apartment, was being found dead by someone who barely knew me, was disappearing into the void that had swallowed so many of us. 6 years in hell had taught me what I was capable of enduring. 6 years in hell had taught me that rock bottom has a basement, that you can always fall further, that there's no floor to how low you can go. But 6 years in hell had also taught me that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling shame, which meant I was still capable of feeling anything. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that tiny spark was enough to start with. I walked away from Lincoln Hospital toward a methadone clinic I'd heard about. I didn't know what would happen. I just knew I had to try. The methadone clinic on Brook Avenue was open at 6 a.m. I showed up at 5:30, already sick, already shaking, already doing the mathematics in my head about what I'd do if they turned me away. There were 20 people ahead of me in line, all of us with the same hollow eyes, the same restless legs, the same desperation written across our faces. We didn't talk much, just stood there in the cold morning, waiting for the doors to open, waiting for relief that came in a paper cup instead of a needle. They let me in, took my information, asked questions I'd been asked 100 times before. How long had I been using? Every day for 6 years. How much? Enough to not be sick, which meant more every month as my tolerance grew. Did I want to get clean? Yes. This time I meant it. The intake counselor was a man named David, middle-aged, patient, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd heard every story and nothing surprised him anymore. He explained how it worked. I'd come in every morning. They'd give me methadone, a synthetic opioid that lasted longer than heroin. That stopped withdrawal without producing much of a high. The dose would be calibrated to keep me stable, keep me from being sick, give me a foundation to start rebuilding from. Methadone isn't a cure, he said. It's a tool. It gives you space to work on everything else, the reasons you started using, the trauma, the life you need to build, but you have to do the work. I nodded. I'd heard versions of this before, but this time felt different. Maybe because I'd almost died 3 days ago. Maybe because I was just so tired of the alternative. Maybe because some part of me that had been buried under 6 years of addiction was finally ready to try living again. They gave me my first dose that morning, 30 milligrams of methadone mixed with orange juice in a small paper cup. I drank it down, felt the bitter liquid coat my throat, waited for something to happen. It wasn't like heroin. There was no rush, no immediate warmth flooding through my veins. Just a gradual easing of the sickness over the next hour. The muscle aches fading, the restlessness quieting, the panic receding. By noon, I felt almost normal. Not high, just not sick. It was strange at first, that absence of sickness without the presence of euphoria. Like standing in a room where there'd always been loud music and suddenly experiencing silence. I didn't know what to do with myself, didn't know how to exist without the constant cycle of sick, well organizing every hour of my day. I went to my first group session that afternoon, sat in a circle with 8 other people in various stages of recovery. Some had been on methadone for years. Some were on their first week like me. We went around introducing ourselves, sharing our stories. I listened to people talk about childhoods marked by abuse, about trauma they'd never processed, about pain they'd tried to numb with heroin, until the numbing became its own kind of pain. When it was my turn, I said my name, said I'd been using for 6 years, said I'd almost died a few days ago, said I didn't know if I could do this, but I wanted to try. The counselor leading the group nodded, said that wanting to try was enough for today, said recovery happened one day at a time, sometimes 1 hour at a time, and all I had to do was not use today. The first week was hard in ways I hadn't expected. The methadone kept me from being physically sick, but it didn't fix everything else. Didn't fix the anxiety that had been buried under heroin for 6 years, that came roaring back now that I wasn't medicating it. Didn't fix the depression, the shame, the grief for everything I'd lost. Didn't fix the fact that I had no job, no home, no skills, no future I could see clearly. I wanted to use. God, I wanted to use, not because the methadone wasn't working, but because using was what I did when I felt bad, when I felt anything, when I needed to escape from myself. The urge would hit me at random times, walking past an old coping spot, seeing someone who looked like they were high, just existing in the same neighborhood where I'd spent 6 years destroying myself. But I didn't use. Not that first day, not the second, not the third. I went to the clinic every morning, drank my methadone, went to groups, talked about things I'd never talked about before. My father's depression, my mother's exhaustion, the sense of helplessness I'd felt watching my neighborhood collapse around me. The counselors said that heroin had been my solution to those feelings. A bad solution, but a solution nonetheless. Said I needed to find better solutions, healthier ways to cope with pain that didn't involve destroying myself. It sounded simple when they said it. It wasn't simple. I relapsed in the 3rd week, not badly, just once. I copped a bag from a dealer I knew, shot up in an alley behind the clinic, felt that familiar warmth, and immediately hated myself for it. The shame was overwhelming. I'd made it almost 3 weeks. I'd been doing so well, and I'd thrown it away for a 30-minute high that didn't even feel as good as I remembered. I went to group the next day and admitted it. Expected judgment, expected to be kicked out, expected the counselor to tell me I'd failed and needed to start over. Instead, David just nodded, said relapse was part of recovery for a lot of people, said it didn't mean I'd failed, didn't mean I had to give up, didn't mean the 3 weeks I'd been clean didn't count, said I could make a different choice today than I'd made yesterday. So I did. I kept showing up, kept taking my methadone, kept going to groups. The urges to use started to space out. Not disappear. I don't think they ever fully disappeared, but become less constant, less overwhelming. I started to have hours where I didn't think about heroin, then days. My body started to heal slowly. I gained weight. Not much, but enough that I didn't look like a skeleton anymore. My skin started to look less gray. The infections cleared up with antibiotics. I had teeth pulled that were too rotten to save, got temporary dentures that made me look almost human again. I reconnected with my mother in the 4th month, just showed up at the apartment one day, knocked on the door, waited to see if she'd even let me in. She opened the door and just stood there looking at me. I could see her trying to figure out if I was high, if I was there to steal from her, if this was another false start in a long series of false starts. "I'm on methadone," I said. "I'm trying to get clean. I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I'm trying." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let me in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my father used to sit during those afternoons when the factory had cut his hours, and we talked. Not about the past. There was too much past, too much pain. We talked about now, about the clinic, about what I was doing to stay clean, about whether I thought I could maintain it. I said I didn't know, said I was taking it one day at a time, said some days were easier than others. She nodded, said she'd been praying for me, said she'd never stopped praying, even when she'd locked me out, even when she thought she'd lost me for good. My father had died while I was using. Heart attack in 1975. I'd been so deep in my addiction that I barely registered it, barely went to the funeral, barely let myself feel anything about it, because feeling meant pain, and pain meant I needed to get high. Now, sitting at that kitchen table with my mother, the grief hit me all at once. I cried for the first time in years, cried for my father, who'd given up long before his heart did, cried for my mother, who'd survived watching both her husband and her son destroy themselves, cried for the 6 years I'd lost, the person I'd been, the future I'd thrown away. My mother didn't say it was okay, didn't say everything would be fine, just sat there with me while I cried. Let me have my grief. Let me begin the long process of feeling everything I'd been running from. Getting a job was harder than I expected. I had no recent work history, no references, no skills beyond survival. I eventually got hired at a warehouse, similar to the one I'd worked at before everything fell apart. Moving boxes, minimum wage. It was honest work, and after 6 years of stealing and lying and degrading myself, honest work felt like a luxury. The South Bronx was still burning around me, still collapsing, still being abandoned by everyone who had the power to help. But I started to notice things I hadn't seen when I was using. Community organizers trying to save buildings, people planting gardens in empty lots, small businesses staying open despite everything. The neighborhood wasn't just dying. Parts of it were fighting to survive, fighting to rebuild, refusing to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only rational response. I joined that fight in small ways. Started volunteering at the clinic, sharing my story with new people coming in, offering the kind of hope I'd needed when I first walked through those doors. It helped to be useful, helped to feel like my suffering had meaning, like the 6 years in hell had taught me something I could use to help others avoid the same descent. Recovery wasn't linear. There were bad days. Days when I wanted to use so badly I could taste it, days when the methadone didn't feel like enough, when sobriety felt like a punishment instead of a gift. Days when I walked past my old coping spots and felt the pull so strong it was like gravity trying to drag me back down. But I stayed clean. One day at a time, sometimes 1 hour at a time, sometimes 1 minute at a time. I rebuilt slowly, carefully, like someone constructing a house on ground that had proven unstable. knowing it could all collapse again, but building anyway, because what else was there to do? I'll never get those 6 years back. I'll never be the person I could have been if I'd never picked up that first bag with Marcus, if I'd never let Jorge show me how to shoot up, if I'd made different choices at 100 different moments. That version of me is gone, dead, mourned and buried. But I survived. I'm still here, and that has to mean something. The heroin took my 20s, took my friends, took my innocence, took my belief that I was special, that bad things happened to other people, that I was somehow immune to the consequences of my choices. It took everything I had and almost took my life. But it didn't take everything. There was still something left when I finally stopped. Some small ember that hadn't been completely extinguished. Some part of me that remembered who I used to be and wanted to find out who I could still become. Recovery taught me that I'm stronger than I thought and more fragile than I'd ever admit. Both can be true. I can be grateful to be alive and also grieve for what I lost. I can be proud of my sobriety and also ashamed of what I did to get here. I can be hopeful about tomorrow and also terrified that I'll wake up one day and throw it all away for 30 minutes of warmth in a cold world. Those 6 years in hell taught me what it means to survive, what it costs, what it requires. They taught me that rock bottom has a basement, that you can always fall further, that there's no floor until you decide to stop falling. They taught me that hope is a muscle that atrophies when you don't use it, but can be rebuilt with patience and practice, and the willingness to keep trying even when trying feels impossible. If you're listening to this in the dark, wherever you are, whatever you're facing, you're not alone in the struggle. None of us are. We're all carrying something, all fighting battles nobody else can see, all trying to survive in a world that doesn't make it easy. I almost didn't survive mine, almost became another statistic, another body in an abandoned building, another person who disappeared into the void and left no trace, but I'm still here, still breathing, still fighting, still learning what it means to live instead of just survive. And if I can make it out, maybe anyone can. Maybe that's the only hope worth holding on to. If you found meaning in this story, join our community by subscribing. Every like and subscription tells me these stories matter. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.